as the little company reels from the death of one of its co-founders, they try to seek a way to stumble forward and continue. I think Gary at this time finds it imperative to carry out the dream that he had, that his best friend believed in and was willing to sacrifice a little bit of his life insurance to make happen. But you have to imagine that the impact of that, or the consequence of that, on Donna Kay is pretty heavy.
When Don died, Donna didn't want the business anymore.
So Donna Kay pretty much decides that she's had enough. I mean, she still has children, and she's now single mom, a widow, and she has a lot of responsibilities to be involved with a company that's not really making her any money. So she agrees to sell out her shares to Gary and Brian.
The way I heard the story was basically Don Kay's widow demanded her half of the company, in cash on my hand. And you can take all that junk that my husband wasted his money on and go sell it for scrap paper and give me my half.
Unfortunately, she really didn't, I don't think, got along too well with Gary.
Also on the horizon for TSR is the second printing of Dungeons & Dragons. Well, the plan was to start printing them immediately after the last one sold in January, but the death of Don Kay really broke up their cadence.
I was contacted by Arneson because this is the time frame where the TS started with a big problem when Don Kay died. And the partnership is resolving, and the financial situation is really treacherous.
In a very short sequence, right after that period of time, they have to decide what to do with Don Kay's shares.
They were handling all the mailings. And it wasn't until like several months later after he died that Gary discovered that she hadn't been mailing out anything. Well, the orders had been accumulating. So that's when they started the process of talking with her about the whole thing, and they moved all the stuff down in the basement, back to Gary's house.
And so they said, we're looking to find people who'd like to invest. And I said to myself, well, I'm in the Army. I don't have a wife and family. I'm just a happy bachelor guy, and the Army feeds me and it puts me, gives me a place to sleep. And I can afford it, so I sent him back a letter, and I said, I'll send you $5,000. Now, $5,000 was a pretty significant chunk of change back then. And I thought, well, they'll be pretty happy with me, right? I got no answer.
And Brian Bloom and I sat down there fulfilling orders. We go down to the post office every day. We get the orders, and then bring them back down to the basement. And essentially, that's what we did. Brian and I he would organize the orders, and I would ship them out.
So the week went by, and finally I got another chance to go down. I said, so what happened? I offered you $5,000, I'm throwing you the life raft, and you're not doing anything. He goes, oh, we got this guy named Brian Bloom. He's got gobs of money. He just solved the problem. He came with the money.
Around the spring of 1975, she and Brian and Gary all sit down and try to make up for the fact that there was no contract of transfer of partnership in this company, but they clearly needed her to be a partner. And she clearly had something invested in this company with the loss of her life insurance policy.
Brian was from a wealthy family, so that's basically about the only thing he understood. So his answer was to get a little more money out of his father or put his own funds in.
So they had some dough. They always hid it. They didn't want anybody to know that they had some money. And Brian was working in his dad's factory and loved D&D so much that he talked his dad into investing some cash into the whole thing.
And that's when Melvin Bloom comes in with more investment, more capital, and becomes a larger shareholder of the company.
Well, I felt a little miffed because why is his money better than mine? I've known you guys forever, and I don't know Brian from Adam, and so on. So I was a little irked by that.
And if he hadn't died, you know, he would have been one of the big partners. And his wife sold out for $4,000, and I told her not to do it, to stay in there.
And then is when the ascendancy of the Bloom family happens and the descent of the Gygax family control over the company begins.
They certainly made a good investment in the company, and they wanted to guard their own investments.
And then in July of 1975, they form TSR Hobbies Incorporated.
Technical Studies Rules and TSR was a true startup. I mean, you know, one of the classic tenets of American economics is that anybody can start a company, anybody in theory can become a success, and this really proves that to be true.
Gary and Brian reformat the company, renaming it, and signing a new contract between themselves as co-founders, co-partners.
And I think the story of TSR proves that anybody with a sufficient idea and enough gumption and creativity can go places with it, and this story proves that.
I only know Brian. He was slow to make decisions, you know, that, so he was somewhat conservative. I think he was a good match with Gary in terms of moderating Gary's sort of flights of fancy.
They were kind of perfect opposites. Gary wanted to spend lots of money and Brian wanted to save lots of money. So really as partners, it worked out great, in the beginning especially. Gary would come up with great ideas and want to spend huge amounts of money on the ideas, and Brian would find out how to spend little amounts of money and still get the idea done. So yeah, they were perfect partners.
I think one of the goals was not just to be a fantasy game company, but to be a game company, a hobby company, and that's why the name TSR Hobbies indicates more than Technical Studies Rules, that already there was a vision to expand the horizons of the company and what they were doing.
So at this point, this company is literally a hobby company, that it's their hobby, that none of these men or young boys are getting paid. And there's not much income other than to cover costs. And they actually don't have any full-time paid employees. I think that Rob and Terry get paid a little bit here and there for doing work, but they're really not employees of the company that are getting a wage.
We were continued momentum in every area. And and Gary was starting to become more specific about what he thought was going to be needed for, you know? So he was exercising his leadership qualities, which he's always had.
After TSR Hobbies Incorporated is formed, Gary approaches Don Laurie of Guidon Games, his old boss, and he tries to strike a deal with him to buy the rights for several titles that Gary worked on. Chainmail, Don't Give Up the Ship, Tractics. These are now TSR titles, and those miniatures games help fortify the company with some existing popular titles. Slowly, TSR is building its catalog of games and is starting to get noticed by the gaming community as a whole.
But it was an exciting time. Things were gathering momentum. The sales of the game products were increasing. There was a lot of new ideas and ideas for new games floating around, some good, some bad, some indifferent.
Now that they have recovered, they know they need to get back to printing things. The strategic review is out, and it is now their house organ, and they are starting to describe all of the products which are coming down the pipeline.
I went and found a copy online and looked at their catalog listing. And the products TSR made a year and a half after D&D came out was Cavaliers and Roundheads, which is a historical miniatures game, Tricolor, which was a historical miniatures game, Chainmail, which was a historical miniatures game, Tractics, which was a historical miniatures game, Panzer Warfare, which was a historical miniatures game, Dungeons and Dragons, which was a fantastic medieval war game campaign, Warriors of Mars, which is kind of a proto-RPG skirmish game, and Star Probe, which was an SPI style game except you were exploring stars instead of, actually more like a 3M exploration game. So they had 5 historical miniatures games and 3 other products. So Gary and Don, in a very real sense, thought they were starting a historical miniatures war game company.
There was a lot going on, and I don't think Gary was going to be able to. He was the type of person who wanted to know exactly what everything where it was. You might say there's a little bit of control to that, you know, where you don't think it'd be done better by others, but you have to start delegating at that point. And he had done so in the past with me. But I think he was starting to see what he considered to be the fruition of all his days and all his dreams.
Finally, in August of this year, Gary is listed as the first full-time paid employee by the company.
So, I think he was on edge. And Mary said later, after talking with Mary, they changed. And there was a specific change in him, in the sense where it was no longer about the camaraderie so much as about just getting things done. So he was in business mode.
And he starts handling all the billing, the ordering. He starts handling the money side of things, which was normally the purview of Donna Kay. And so now he has taken up the burden of that part of the company, as well as the creative part of the company.
It's very busy. There was no time to think. There was no, the more you finished, the more there was to do. The company was moving very quickly.
You have to understand, when we're talking about company for TSR, it is really Gary and Brian. They have Rob and Terry Kuntz, and Ernie is helping out around the place, and the rest of the Gygax children. Mary is doing typing, and it is not a corporation. It is a group of friends, associates, and family members all trying to make this thing work.
My mother worked for my dad, answering phones and doing some secretarial work. I stayed home and watched the children after school, which, you know, that didn't make me very happy. I kind of had to be the adult, and I couldn't really, you know, so there was sacrifices that were made, and I got disinterested in school because of it. Dad decided that I was going to work for the company full-time, since I wasn't going to school after a while. So I worked, Ernie and I worked for the company from very early on. All of their product and the Dungeon Hobby Shop is moving out of Gary's house. It's moving out of 330 Center Street, and it's going to a new location.
Williams and Marshall, yeah. The old Kruver house, they had sold it, and TSR picked it up.
They find out the building they want to move into on William and Marshall Streets in Lake Geneva is fraught with problems. There are electrical problems, plumbing problems. There needs to be carpentry work done. And that's where Terry Kuntz steps in.
My second job was as a construction employee.
My brother rebuilt that place. He rewired it, recarpeted it, did all the upstairs offices, put in the counter space, did all the wiring downstairs in the basement, and all the fixtures and everything. And then put in all the studs for hanging the miniatures and fixed it up as a game room, and redid the kitchen from a kitchen with the counter space into a shipping area. And then did the pantry inside and put up shelves in there, which used to be an improvised kitchen pantry, and it was now a shelf area for books. And so you can go on and on and on about what he did in that, and he was very busy. You didn't see him. He was over at the house all the time.
Their grand opening does not happen until the third week in April in 1976.
Everyone was starting to sense that, this is growing, because you're out of the basement now, you're out of a basement concern, we're through the play test, we've invested everything, all our time, we've done all the groundwork, we're now out of the basement, we're into the house, a reconverted house, right? Where it's the next step.
The reason it's so critical for this new location for the Dungeon Hobby Shop to be open is because they now have many more products, and they have boxes of product lying around, and 330 Center Street just wasn't enough to hold them all. But what they really needed was they needed a storefront that wasn't Gary's house, that you didn't have to go through the living room in order to get your product, and that was a little more practical for them to function. And it eased the strain on the Gygax family too.
There was a lot of outlay of money, and there was some money that was being saved, by others like my brother, who saved thousands for TSR at the time, working at minimum wage, and was promised a job as the Dungeon Hobby Shop manager.
Technical state rules did not have the funds to pay for a new employee. So I was asked to go to a governmental organization to get economic funds at the time, because the area was under economic constraint according to the federal program. And I received minimum wages per week from the organization. And the only thing TSR had to do was ask for those wages.
And so everyone was busy. I was doing the convention, I was doing writing, I was doing playtesting, I was still doing DMing when I could, I was doing shipping. We were putting on games at the hobby shop.
They have been working with Dave Arneson remotely about a manuscript for Blackmore, like Gary's supplement, Greyhawk for Dungeons & Dragons, which introduced new rules and classes.
There wasn't a moment that was being wasted. We were all doing something. Whether it's at home when you were sitting writing something and coming in and they call you up on the phone, will you do this? Will you come on over here, we're playtesting that? There was never a let up on it. You didn't think about it either because you're used to it. You're just doing it.
Dungeons & Dragons was starting to really gain momentum, and the board games were starting to be a part of what they were doing. They had a magazine that they wanted to start, which later became Dragon Magazine.
They were starting the publishing of the Dragon Magazine. Back then, the printing labels, because there still wasn't computers, home computers, there was little index cards, and you had to type in this box. So that's how I learned to type, is typing. I get paid by the card.
Over several months, they keep asking about the Blackmore manuscript, and Dave says he's getting it together, he's working on it, he needs to put a few more things together. Eventually, he sends them the manuscript, and when they get it, it is not what they expect.
He brought 3 manuscripts down, and he handed them over to the editors, and they found them unintelligible. Bad typing, bad grammar, bad everything.
I had to do his manuscripts. And I couldn't believe that he even passed 4th grade. He couldn't spell, he couldn't punctuate. It was unbelievable. I mean, he had some, his ideas, but as far as his writing them down, I mean, he was really almost illiterate as far as I was concerned, and I had to type those manuscripts.
For months through 1975, Gary and Brian had kept up a correspondence with Dave Arneson. Dave Arneson is sort of their unofficial representative in the Twin Cities area. Well, Dave has this family of gamers that are young like he is and are interested in designing games. So TSR relies on Dave to be their go-between.
So that was my first job. I think Ernie was working after school in the hobby shop downstairs. And then I worked my way, became a receptionist, cross-trained in sales. I always went to conventions and worked in the sales booth. So I kind of learned a little bit of everything as the years went by.
Despite all of their problems with contract negotiations and Dave's seemingly impossible demands for the situation, he finally is convinced by Gary to come and work for TSR.
He was not pleased with Dave because Dave didn't want to settle easy and quick. They didn't want to release his rights to D&D, and he wanted lots of dough.
David was told he was going to have to take half the royalties he'd been getting. And Gary said, well, I'm going to take half the royalties, so you should take half the royalties too, because Brian's told me that our royalties are insanely generous, which they certainly were. The problem was then the company could barely make ends meet. They were getting these insanely generous royalties out of the not very big cash flow.
When he came down there, it was that Gary, wanted to have collaboration and stuff like, create more games.
And I said, well, I don't think I'm going to do that then. And Gary said, well, too bad, I'm your co-author, so I signed for both of us. And Arneson said, you can't do that. And Gary said, I certainly can. Brian says I can, right?
Dave arrives in the winter of 1976, and he is immediately given a set of business cards to tuck in his briefcase. And the business cards tell us that he is their research director.
I think he enjoyed the notion of getting work for his friends from the Twin Cities, and I think he perhaps enjoyed the prestige of being the recruiter, as it were.
So he comes in as this sort of golden child, while there are other people in the company who are barely getting paid, are working part-time, or just plain family members working for free.
He was amazed at Dave in that, Gary really did, I want to say, 95% of the work to make D&D happen, and was nice to Dave Arneson and said, half of it's yours, Dave, even though he didn't do half. So he was always amazed at Dave's attitude when Gary felt he did most of the work.
I didn't care for him. Well, he wasn't very polite or very nice, I guess. He certainly wasn't a Bill Hoyer or Mike Carr or any of those nice people.
Now TSR is growing. They're actually starting to pay their employees. They also bring in 3 new employees.
He had his fellows. There was Dave McGarry and there was Mike Carr, and they were all his buddies from college.
In those days, I had, after working in management for the Ground Round, I was up to $205 a week as my salary. And Gary said, if you come to work for us at TSR, we'll pay you $110 a week. So almost a 50% pay cut, but the opportunity to do something that you love and not work 6 days a week, that's appealing too.
He brings in Dave McGarry.
He had tried to recruit me, but I was in Boston at the time, and I was working as a Xerox operator in the basement of the Harvard Law School.
Gary has known about Dave McGarry's dungeon game for almost 4 years now. Dave McGarry attempts to take this game without Gary to Don Lowry.
I had sent the prototype to Don Lowry, Lowry Games, or Guidon Games, I guess is what they call them. And he figured out that he couldn't afford to print the board.
And so ultimately, Dave McGarry goes back to Gary to see if TSR's new company will publish it for him. In 1974, they begin discussions of it, and they discuss it through Dave Arneson during that entire time period. But when David McGarry finally gets to TSR, Gary is able to directly interact with him, and he is able to encourage Dave to finish the design.
I went to Lake Geneva, and I went there to be the treasurer because I seemed to have some sort of business acumen And Gary was somewhat excited about the fact that somebody's actually going to show up and know how to do books, how to deal with banks and other stuff like that. Not that I had done very much dealing with banks and things like that, but at least I understood what the practice was supposed to be.
Because we're starting to move towards departments at that point. Like I was in charge of shipping, Gary was in accounting, my brother was up front, even though under my car was ostensibly in control of the counter in the whole hobby shop. And then we had design, we had artists upstairs who was supposedly bringing in new talent and everything from the Twin Cities, which he did. He brought in Mike Carr's games and of course McGarry stuff had already been brought in.
This is where the prolificity of Gary's communication really comes to the fore and really drives the success of the company. His communication and his desire, willingness, and energy to reach out to all aspects of the hobby make TSR a success, because they don't have big catalogs, they don't have a distribution network, there's no actual industry in place to support them. They have no distribution system except for direct to the customer. And so it is through Gary's sheer force of personality and strength of communication that he makes TSR, he wills TSR to succeed.
It was just amazing period of doing.
I think that the best time that we had there as a group where everything was cooking was the Gen Con at the Horticultural Hall. Everything, it was a really successful convention. Everybody was working together. We were getting the production out. It was an amazingly fun time. It looked like the future was going to go, perfectly the way we had wanted it, and then things started going sour there.
Something curious happens. Dave is at TSR for several months as the research director. And so you have Dave being given this important position and being relied upon by Gary to inject a spirit of design and ingenuity into the company that Gary thinks he can help guide into success and products. But it doesn't happen.
There came a time relatively early on when there's this huge order, a bunch of orders came in, and it was all hands on to get the shipments out. And so everybody sort of dropped their regular roles and went in package boxes, writing labels and just getting the stuff out the door.
Gary believes that Dave and he are of the same cut of cloth, and that with a little guidance, Dave can become what Gary is, a great communicator, a great facilitator, a great collator of talent, a great collator of ideas, a doer, a person who can take risks and can make game designs happen and isn't afraid to put them out for the world. But unfortunately, Dave can't fulfill that because Dave isn't that sort of person. Dave is a contemplative, introverted designer with 1,000 game designs in his head, but very few on paper. And soon we discover that Dave Arneson, this brilliant creator and designer of games, has been moved to the shipping department.
And so when I arrived there, and he's now down in shipping, and he's a really good shipper. I mean, he can close out the 100 boxes in an afternoon that we needed, and that's what was needed to keep the company going. And I think that ultimately that sort of put the division between them, was because now all of a sudden he's downstairs and Gary's upstairs.
But for a person who's there to do game design, he's not doing much of it.
All the creative offices were up on the second floor, and all the nitty-gritty stuff was the inventories in the basement. The shipping's out in the old kitchen, and I'm in a little den with my books and getting this stuff going. And as the company got more orders, it became really more important that somebody run that shipping and somebody run the books, because if you don't have that, then you don't have anything. And we came to really understand that. I stopped basically being a treasurer after a while, and I became just a bookkeeper, because we had to do that to keep the cash flow going, to keep the business running. And Arneson's, we graded at this, but we also understood that this was a sort of necessary thing.
There have been allegations in some of the books written recently about the breakup between David and Gary, to the effect that not much product came out of David during this period.
And now he's exhausted at the end of the day. Not having a lot of room for creative ideas. Sitting at a typewriter often becomes more of a burden. So when people have made a comment, well, Arneson was down there for 6 months and he hardly put anything out. Well, yes, and there's reasons why, and probably the biggest reason is because he's sort of doing the thing that the business needed to be doing to stay alive.
And I wonder to what degree that was because he wasn't writing stuff, or to what degree it was he was writing stuff that would be always rejected back to him with a 1,000,001 picky, stupid changes dictated on it by somebody, we're not sure who really didn't want to see him publish anything.
TSR would not have been where they got to if Arneson hadn't been the shipper and I hadn't been the bookkeeper.
And he also said, we'll give you the option to buy some stock in the company, and if this enterprise succeeds, that'll be worth something, which may offset this pitiful salary that we're offering you.
I had sold the rights for stock. I owned 7.5% of TSR for a while. Part of that was to lower the price. Dungeon, when it first came out, was $12.50, which was still pretty expensive. I wanted it under $10. With about dropping my royalty, it went down to $10.50. Not where I wanted it, but it was definitely better than the $12.50 it was.
The relationship between David McGarry and Gary Gygax is a very interesting one.
The Harvard Business School sent stuff to our thing. One of them was about the stages that companies go through in terms of asset management and how do you grow a company. And Gary, was trying to, grow his company, and I was all worried about, this different stages that have to go on there. So when I saw this come across, I made a copy for myself, and then I shipped him a copy, and I said, we have to really be careful. You need to be careful about how this works, because it could get away from you. So, and he wrote back, we'll never let that happen, never.
Well, TSR at the time that he came to them was a stage 1 company, an inventor company or an innovator company that moved into a market that had not existed before. And so when this company moves into this market, there's no competition and there's incredible quick expansion.
So ultimately, he did fall into the problems that the inventor trying to become this what they call the second stage, was sort of inflation time, where you're growing really rapidly. You're trying to bring in the amount of resources needed to funnel that growth, and you can't retain a lot of artistic control, so to speak, on how the business runs. But we weren't quite there. When I was there, we were just on the verge of having that sort of crossover into the next thing.
Armed with this knowledge of the future of his company, Gary Gygax goes into the waning months of 1976 with a hopeful but cautious approach. He does not have Don Kay next to him to guide him through these what will become exciting but challenging times. And it's really evident during a particular dinner where he has Dave McGarry over.
It actually was at that one of those dinners where I put my foot in it. I had the 5 stages in mind, and I sort of said I was looking forward to the day when we were so big that people would forget, who Gary Gygax was. I was thinking of IBM, I was thinking of AT&T, these very large companies that after a while, you don't know who was the beginnings of those things. It's very rare. Well, they were insulted. They thought that I had insulted them, when it was nothing but the highest praise in my mind was that we would become so fabulously wealthy and fabulously large as a company that we would sort of drift away in history. They insulted. And from that point on, which I never understood until much, much later, that's how they interpreted that statement. And ultimately that led to the fallout that Gary and I had.
And that, though he doesn't know it, really hurts Gary to the core. And his relationship with Gary is forever changed at that moment.
After we had that dinner and I made my faux pas, if you will, Gary was getting more distance from me.
Dave McGarry runs afoul of Brian and Gary once again when a foreign licensing deal with Jedco reveals what David sees as a clear illegal act.
The Australian distributor was complaining that we were shipping it the wrong way and we needed to do something about it. And Gary said, take care of this. Well, I thought that he was asking me to do something illegal, which it turns out wasn't. But I was just, that was my impression at the time. And since we were sort of getting distant, so I wrote him a letter of resignation. I said I couldn't do this. And then he accepted the letter, but ultimately figured out that what he had asked me to do was to look at the regulations and fit, to what they were, so that we would satisfy the Australian distributor. Well, even when Gary didn't want me around anymore, and so since I had resigned, it didn't matter what kind of explanation I would come up with, and I didn't really want to go back. But we had the stockholders meeting at the time, in that time frame.
There's a meeting in November, and the whole company is invited to this meeting.
We were in Gary's office. They had set up some chairs for us outsiders, the folding chairs in front of his desk. Brian was sitting behind Gary, and the lighting wasn't so great.
Dave Arneson is there, and Brian Bloom is there, and Gary is there. Also, the young employees are there. Rob Kuntz is there.
At that same time, there was a division in the company about where the company should go. That was coming from the stockholders on one side, which I will call the Arneson side.
And I think I somewhat led the charge on this one, because I wanted the company to grow. And you're not going to get anywhere if you don't have the professional types on your boards. And from my point of view, it was like we needed to expand our board. We need to bring in higher skilled sets. I wanted to get an accountant on the board. I wanted to get a lawyer on the board.
He's been warned by David McGarry that eventually they will not have the skill set to take this company to the next level. And so a suggestion is made by Dave Arneson and Dave McGarry that Melvin Bloom, who is now a major stockholder in the company and has been for several months, they suggest that since Melvin has a business background, that perhaps he would be suited for being on the board.
And they just couldn't see. They felt threatened by it. They thought the control was trying to be wrested from them.
So when the suggestion is made by Dave McGarry, and it's suggested by Dave Arneson as well, Gary realizes that they want to put Melvin Bloom on the board, and he realizes that he may be on the losing side of this, and he will no longer be an equal partner on this board, and soon it will be a Bloom company. And I think that scares Gary.
My brother and I did not know that that there was a rift developing between Arneson and Gary.
When we got to the sort of the nitty-gritty of the voting on certain ideas, and I couldn't remember this. I can't remember the specifics any longer, but I know that it didn't go well.
And then it's, well, I guess we're just going to have to vote on this then.
The table is going around, and obviously Arneson wants it. David McGarry wants it.
And they walk there around the table that finally get to Brian. And everybody's voted for Arneson except him and Gary. It gets to Brian. And Gary says, well, Brian, how do you vote? And Brian says, I'm with you, Gary.
Which essentially meant that Arneson was out. Okay?
That drives the wedge in right there. That plants him. I am the only guy who keeps you in power against this den of iniquitous traitors.
He believes that with his usual force of personality that he has swayed them.
Gary laid down his iron-foot will about what the direction that the company was going to take.
I think that the fact that Arneson had sort of sided with his stock, because he had some, that was sort of a straw as far as Gary was concerned.
It was a pressure cooker at this point, and there was something wrong going on.
Gary and Brian thought that what we were trying to do was to take over the company. And that's why there's this huge fight, and that's, I think, that ultimately was what caused the Gary and Arneson to break.
Well, afterwards, their notion was voted down, even by Brian. Brian voted against it.
But then what happens is a pretty shocking moment in the history of TSR.
So I voiced one of my concerns about about a change that could be needed, and I believe it was a minor thing. But I think Gary was tense at the time during the stockholders meeting because of what was coming from the other side of the room. And when I said that, it almost looked like I was siding with them, even though I didn't even know what their issue was, right? And he leapt out of his seat, for he was behind his desk, and so was Brian Bloom during the stockholders meeting, and leaned across it in my direction, looked me right in the eye, and screamed bloody murder in my face. He flew into a purple rage, which stunned the entire occupants of the stockholders in the room into silence. And then he sat back down, and quite honestly, I was so stunned I can't remember what he screamed at me.
And Rob says he was shaking with rage.
When you have the president and a former, comrade and gamer and father figure standing up and screaming bloody murder, when you have this tension-packed sort of exchange where he's not even explaining to you what the hell's going on, but he's just telling you. And there's a lot of loss going on at this point for understanding. And at that point, I had the feeling there was something very wrong.
Rob Kuntz describes the scene at the bar where Dave Sutherland is there and Dave Arneson is there, and they're crying in their drinks.
The Minnesota people ended up down at Popeyes, which is an eating establishment, drinking establishment. And that's the second time I saw a grown person crying in my life. That was Dave Arneson. He was down there and he wasn't drinking. He was being consoled for some reason by his friends, McGarry and Carr. And he was actually crying because it meant that something had happened that wasn't going to fulfill his destiny. And he had brought down a lot of these people. He brought in McGarry. He brought in Carr. He had brought the idea of Dungeons and Dragons.
And he's weeping and he's saying, I thought we were just all going to be a bunch of friends designing games.
I know one thing. And my hunches have normally been correct. It wasn't something, one, I understood or something I wanted to understand or be around anymore.
We had this dream of, doing stuff at the beginning when I first got there. But by the time we got into November, I arrived in June. By the time we got into November, there's enough acrimony in the air that, in retrospect, if I have been doing anything, I should have been up into Gary's and Brian's offices and saying, we need to be doing this. And maybe we would have had a falling out sooner because they wanted to retain the control in a way that was going to doom them to remaining the small company that they would have. The product carried them into the next stage, not them.
About a week after that is when I didn't want to be in shipping anymore. I said, this is, I want to go into design because this is where I've been all my life. This is what I've been grooming for. This is what I'm doing. And so then that's when I got the no. I mean, once again, no communication, no reason.
And then immediately thereafter, Arneson is fired.
So I tendered my resignation. I withdrew my stocks as stockholder. And that was it. I was out the door.
I know that Arneson was fired, was basically fired. But I'm having a hard time remembering what that was, how that went. But we were both sitting now in an apartment that we owed money on.
I put in the raise officially, demanded a raise, but I didn't really say, well, how much. But he came back saying that what they could give me was a nickel. And at that time, I was getting fed up with the clothes I was wearing in the hobby shop. I wasn't eating very well, and I was having troubles making payments on my car and my rent. I needed some extra money.
But we had to leave town because, there's no job. There's nothing else to do in Lake Geneva.
Well, Gary simply came down and asked me to take out the trash, and I told him that I was busy with other operations, that it didn't seem feasible for me to go up and clean toilets when customers were walking into the building.
He thought that Gary was trying to push him for some reason. Well, finally, he just kept on doing this petty stuff with him. And so he knew my brother had a hair trigger kind of mentality. He had seen it demonstrated in games. So Terry went up and quit. This is after he had saved the company thousands of dollars.
So I told him I quit and handed him my keys.
This all transpired about within a period of 4 months after that stockholders meeting. But that means that within 4 months, David McGarry quit. I quit. My brother ostensibly was forced out, and so was Arneson. That's 4 out of 6 people were sitting at that table on November '72 when the concept was unveiled. Whether that is meaningful or not, it certainly is interesting.
Well, there's a poignancy, I would say. Whenever a failed dream sort of actually becomes the failed dream, you have a loss, and so it was. And then there's also the fear of the future. When you have the dream, you're working towards it. You have a confidence of moving into the future. When the future's hazy, the 8-ball future hazy, try again, right? Then it's not as fun. It can be depressing, and I would say that our drives away from, our going away from TSR was a new journey, but it's a loss at the same time.
My final interpretation of that is that once Gary decided that his ship had come in, so to speak, there was nothing that was going to stand in the way of that.
It was an exciting early time with the synergy of Gygax and Arneson, but at some point I think they wanted to take the game in different directions. And that led to Dave leaving TSR, which was unfortunate, and it led to other problems and conflict and litigation down the road. But that also allowed Gary and Brian and the remaining creative staff to kind of continue and to grow that concept with more products, and that became Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and really kind of just keep going with it. So even though it may not have been in the direction that Dave Arneson originally wanted or thought or felt it should go, I think the record proves that it was very successful, and the game continued to grow in popularity, and a lot of good things came out of that.
Gary's attempt to move himself away from Dave, a lot of people will say that that is when Gary tried to steal it from Dave. But I think that's incredibly unfair. If you look at how much work Gary put into this, and from the absolute rags he was coming from, and Dave was still receiving his royalties for Dungeons and Dragons. He didn't deny him that. But Gary wanted to establish the fact that there was one person working on this game. There was one person who was the driving force behind this game being successful. And it wasn't Dave Arneson. It was Gary Gygax.
It's like so many startups where the people who are behind it originally and they have an original synergy go in different directions, or they don't see eye to eye. I mean, that's unfortunately typical of a lot of startups, companies in all sorts of lines of business. So it was not a surprise, I guess, in that regard. It's certainly unfortunate, and it led to some bad feelings for a while, and was a bump in the road. But was something that TSR was able to overcome in the long run.
So Dad had been unhealthy for a really long time, dealing with cancer, and that had been a big part of his life for a long time. We finally had gotten the news that treatments were no longer working, and it was time to talk about what those next steps were. And that was very emotional and very intense. We cried, we got angry, and it was a Wednesday. And every Wednesday, a couple of Dad's buddies always came over, and they gamed.
I went to visit Dave with a friend of mine a couple weeks before he passed. And he didn't want to talk about how he felt. He didn't want to talk about his illness. He wanted to talk about gaming, because that was what he was interested in.
And so evening came, the guys came over, we talked about what was going on and cleared the table, and Dad gamed. And it was the perfect evening for him. And I'm so thankful that he was able to do that. It's intense and a lot of feelings, and yet his buddies were there for him. So it was really special for them, for him, for me and my family to witness that.
I waited down there for Dave McGarry to come down, and McGarry and I saw David at the very end, and I was glad I had. But he was one of those give yourself morphine drip machine things, where you can adjust it yourself for the pain. This is one of the things they give you when it's pretty obvious you're going to die, but it's a good deal. I mean, they let you self-medicate, right? And They don't normally do that on morphine, but when it's pretty obvious you're going to die anyhow, they're willing to go there. And so he could control his own pain levels right then. And he stopped giving himself morphine so he could clear his head up so he could talk to us, which I thought was a very brave thing to do. And finally, after we talked for a while, he said, well, guys, I think we're going to need a little more morphine now, so I'm not going to be able to talk to you much. And so you can go. So we left, and then he didn't talk to us again.
That if somehow, if the internet had existed in 1970, chainmail would be a PDF attached to the Lake Geneva Gaming Society's website, and maybe they'd be selling it, but quite probably it would simply be a free download. Blackmore would be Dave Arneson's Blackmore expansion on chainmail, and there would, then Greyhawk would be Gary Gygax's modifications, and they'd just be PDFs on various websites. And in some ways, the world would be a remarkably different place. And Dave opined that he agreed with this because that's the spirit when it first started. I mean, never mind once it became monetized, because that changes everything. But that was the original spirit, that we were just a bunch of guys playing games.
Although Gary, his faith in Dave is never shaken. And his faith in Dave actually lasts well past the lawsuits, the loss of TSR, and up until Gary's death.
I'm proud for the opportunity that my father gave me to be involved with all these things that he liked, but he always allowed me the opportunity as long as I put forth some effort. So I just want to thank him for that. I really miss Dad.
I think that when my dad would game and he would make an adventure, that's what it was about. Taking a group of people that you care about and live an adventure. But he felt that way about real life. If there was an opportunity to travel or our family to do something, he jumped at the chance to have an adventure and really experience life.
And I'm very proud to be even part of it to a certain extent, And it's a wonder to see, even to this day, the fandom is so responsive.
One of the best feelings was talking to another individual and hear them talk about this amazing childhood that they had because of the friends that they knew and that they met while gaming. And that came from playing Dungeons and Dragons in the very beginning. And how awesome is that, to foster great friendships, amazing childhoods? It's just huge. And I'm very proud of my dad for doing that. And he really took that to heart.
So he was a great guy. I liked him a lot. He had his ups and downs and his hard times, but he was instrumental.
I never really realized until all of this lately that how just important it was, and how many people were really admired him and really thanked him for what he did. Mm-hmm. And I think that it was really nice for him to know that before he died.
At what point did sitting around a table, drinking beer with your friends and talking about pretending to be an elf turn into serious business?
I have to talk about the personality of Gary. He's kind of the charismatic, brash risk taker. Mm-hmm. And Dave Arneson is the quiet, demure tinkerer. And one is straight-laced Boy Scout and the other is hippie. And so they do come from two different worlds. There are differences in the two people, but they have a commonality in games, of course. And their differences are what allows them to create Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons was so influential and remains so to this day because it opened up new horizons of gaming and of imagination and of creativity, not just among young people, but anybody who played it. And the beauty of Dungeons & Dragons is anybody can play it. If you've got an imagination and a little bit of smarts and some patience and a creative mind and an imaginative mind where you can picture these things as they're being described to you, you can play.
The whole point was, though, this was not a one-dimensional game. Okay? You want one-dimensional game, we got Scrabble, or we have Monopoly. And those were all the models that preceded it that Arneson essentially swept aside and said they don't exist in this case. He merged all sorts of different disparate ideas under this system. It's a whole new ballgame. It's a paradigm shift.
So I think the legacy of it is that it really spawned a whole new way of looking at gaming, a whole new way of looking at fantasy and science fiction in a participatory way. And that inspired filmmakers, video game makers, board game makers, people who made modules for this, people who created other role-playing games. It really exploded the possibilities, and it got tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people to look at gaming in a new way and to look at fantasy in a new way that they could participate in it personally and could enjoy it on a new level.
It's kind of surreal to think, my dad started that, it started in our basement,
Look at the popularity of video games today and the movies, not just the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but I mean there's endless movies, and the comic book genre and fantastic superheroes and all of that doesn't all go back to Dungeons & Dragons, but the interest in that, I think, is largely attributable to Dungeons & Dragons opening the possibilities up in the media and in the gaming world and in the minds of the participants and the fans.
I think it was in the 80s. My dad would love to go into schools, and he would bring all of his different-sided dice, and he would get to work with the kids and teach them math. And so people often thought of games as not that, as a waste of time or a time killer, but it was, you had to do math when you had your adventure.
One of the things that Dungeons and Dragons did to the overall hobby, I thought that was great, right? When I was at wargaming conventions in the pre-Dungeons and Dragons era, if you saw a woman there, it was somebody's girlfriend who'd been dragged in, or it was a wife who was there to get the car keys. Negligible female participation, just a handful of people. Gary had a daughter that might be there before there was Dungeons and Dragons, but that was about the size of one in 100, 1 in 200, 1 in 1,000. Right? Dungeons and Dragons came in, and soon we discovered that girlfriends and women were coming in and going, that's kind of cool.
I really enjoyed playing Dungeons and Dragons, the little bit that I did, but the thing is I was a girl and it was all guys. And I just, did not, so that's why I didn't pursue gaming is, I didn't want to be hanging out with the young boys. I wanted to hang out with my girlfriends. It is predominantly men, but now there's a lot more women and families, and so it's really changed a lot.
And so my dad really liked bringing his dice in and going to schools whenever he could and use that opportunity to foster learning in a fun way and encourage that. He really enjoyed doing that.
Now, I'm a teacher, and so I found out all the things that you could teach by doing Dungeons and Dragons. Number one, you're teaching medieval society. You're teaching about the Middle Ages. Number two, you've got all the mythological creatures. They study myths in high school and so on. And so here is a precursor letting them figure that stuff out. They're doing all the math because they get treasure, and if the group's going to get the treasure, they have to
computate, add up all the gems and the values of all the gems and the money, and then divide it amongst their people. So they're using all their math skills. We were teaching them mapping, directions, following directions, all that. All these things were just marvelous.
At one point, I taught D&D in class. So we did a little bit of chess, but we also did a D&D thing. And I had to devise a dungeon that I could take in a class of like 35 people at once and start make it entertaining and slay them off as it goes, so that they want to, they keep active, somehow keep with it. The communities are powerful, because I run into some of these people from years ago when I taught back in the early 70s, and they're, say, because of you, I'm still gaming. It's like, oh, okay. Is that good or bad? I guess it's good. Oh, good. Thank you.
And I said, okay, so what did I learn? I learned let them do what they want to do within some reason, right? Steer them a little, but let them do what they want to do. And after looking at it over the next few years, I went back to it and I said, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. And that the objective is not winning. The objective is having a good time playing.
The idea of a game where you can try anything and there's really, in essence, no limits, was totally new and very appealing. People, especially, we in our daily lives are kind of limited with what we can or can't do, but now if we play in a game situation, we can throw magic spells, or we can invoke, divine assistance to our cause, and we can do all sorts of things that there's no way that we could accomplish in our daily life, and there's no limit to that, to what we might attempt or possibly accomplish. And that's tremendously appealing, almost to, I would say, to almost anyone, to think that you can become a hero.
I know that it is amazing, when I say, that came from a game.
I like to say that if, in terms of who's the father of role-playing games and all that, right? I guess if I'd never done Brownstein, maybe nobody would be playing role-play games. If David hadn't gotten in the picture, almost certainly nobody. Gary made the difference in this respect. If Gary hadn't stuck his neck out, got a loan, put his whole life, economic future, his house, his family, everything, his business on the line to fund getting Dungeons and Dragons into print when the track record for games really stunk. And he's gonna go take a crack at that. That took a lot of guts. And if he hadn't done that, the only people playing Dungeons and Dragons, or whatever it became called, would be people who've met Dave Arneson and played that silly thing he does. Because Gary made the difference between being a cool thing that you did with the guys in Minneapolis do this thing and nobody else had ever heard of it, and everybody in the world's heard of it.
When we look at the sort of the history of Dungeons and Dragons, we I think are starting to forget the wonderful gaming system that they have, that Gygax and Arneson had come up with, and I want to make sure that the world remembers them for the wonderful game system that they gave us, the entertainment value, and the camaraderie that engenders. It allows us to be kind to each other in ways that we would never be able to achieve otherwise. So I want to, let's remember them for the gift that they've given us.
Amen.
Okay.